Between 1847 and 1851, 9 plantation owners across central Alabama died in their beds with identical injuries, suffocated in their sleep, no signs of struggle, bedroom doors locked from the inside. Investigators found something peculiar in each estate's records. Every victim had recently purchased the same enslaved woman whose name appeared in ledgers simply as Dinah. 7 victims were found with cotton fibers deep in their throats. The remaining 2 had feather down from their own pillows embedded in their nasal passages. Local newspapers called it nighttime apoplexy. The planters knew better. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button and drop your state or city in the comments below. The child who learned. Silence too well. Wilcox County, Alabama, in the winter of 1825, was where an enslaved woman named Ruth gave birth to her 7th child, in a cabin that smelled of wood smoke and blood, and the particular despair that came from bringing life into a world designed to destroy it. The infant girl made no sound when she entered the world, a silence that terrified the midwife until the baby finally drew breath and released a cry so faint it barely disturbed the air. Ruth named her Dinah, after a grandmother sold away before Ruth herself was born, and watched with growing unease as the child developed an unnatural quietness that persisted beyond infancy into a childhood defined by observation rather than sound. The silence was not muteness, the plantation doctor confirmed when Ruth finally gathered courage to voice her concerns to the overseer. Dinah could speak when absolutely necessary, could form words with adequate clarity, but she chose not to, preferring instead to communicate through gestures, through compliance, through an eerie stillness that made even other enslaved children uncomfortable in her presence. By age 5, Dinah had learned to move through the quarters without disturbing dust, to complete assigned tasks without drawing attention, to make herself so unremarkable that overseers would sometimes startle when they noticed her standing nearby, having forgotten she was present at all. Ruth understood, in the way that enslaved mothers understood all threats to their children's survival, that this silence was both protection and danger. A quiet child drew less punishment, attracted less attention from white people whose notice often preceded violence. But a child too quiet, too strange, too different from expected patterns, risked being labeled defective or unnatural, categorizations that could result in being sold away to buyers who specialized in purchasing damaged property at discount prices for work that destroyed people quickly. The plantation where Dinah spent her first 12 years was called Oakwood, owned by a man named Thomas Coalfield, who had inherited the property and its 43 enslaved workers from his father and operated it with efficient brutality that maximized profit, while maintaining a reputation for relative leniency compared to neighboring plantations where mortality rates suggested that owners calculated replacement costs against the expense of adequate food and shelter. Coalfield's plantation was not kind, because no plantation built on human bondage could claim kindness, but it was survivable for those who learned to navigate its systems of reward and punishment. Dinah learned those systems faster than children twice her age. She learned which white people could be approached, and which would strike out reflexively at any enslaved person who entered their visual field. She learned the times of day when punishment was most likely, when overseers were drunk or angry, or looking for excuses to demonstrate authority. She learned to read weather in the faces of those who owned her, to predict storms before they arrived, to take shelter in invisibility before violence descended. But she also learned something else, something that would prove far more dangerous to those who thought they controlled her. She learned that white people, particularly wealthy white people, accustomed to being served by enslaved workers, eventually stopped seeing those workers as human beings capable of independent thought. They would speak freely in her presence, would discuss business matters and family secrets and private cruelties as if she were furniture, as if her ears did not process language, as if her silent observation meant her mind did not record and analyze and remember everything she witnessed. By the time Dinah turned 12 years old, she had accumulated more knowledge about the Coalfield family's finances, infidelities, and vulnerabilities than any enslaved person should possess, and she had learned that silence was not weakness but rather a weapon that patient people could deploy with devastating precision. The mistress who first noticed. Margaret Coalfield, mistress of Oakwood Plantation, where Dinah spent the first 12 years of her life, prided herself on understanding the temperaments of her husband's property in ways that enhanced household efficiency. She had learned to read the subtle signals that indicated which enslaved workers could be trusted in proximity to valuables, which required constant supervision, and which possessed the intelligence and discretion necessary for positions inside the main house. Dinah caught Margaret's attention at age 8, not through any overt action, but through her profound ability to be present without being noticed, to move through rooms without disturbing the air, to anticipate needs before they were voiced. Margaret began requesting Dinah for increasingly complex household tasks, testing the girl's capabilities and finding them remarkable for someone so young and untrained in formal domestic service. Dinah learned to set tables according to proper etiquette by watching once and replicating the pattern perfectly. She learned which silver pieces corresponded to which courses, which glasses suited which wines, which serving temperatures pleased Margaret most. More impressively, she learned to read the subtle shifts in household mood that preceded guests arriving, or arguments erupting, positioning herself to be useful without being summoned. The other enslaved workers in the main house noticed Dinah's ascent with mixture of resentment and relief. Resentment because the girl's competence made their own efforts appear inadequate by comparison, creating pressure to match standards they found exhausting. Relief because Dinah's presence seemed to improve Margaret's temperament, reducing the frequency of punishments that could be triggered by minor infractions like imperfectly ironed linens or meals served 30 seconds behind schedule. But there was something about Dinah that made Margaret increasingly uneasy as the girl approached adolescence. It was not anything Dinah did wrong, not any failure of service or breach of protocol, but rather the opposite. Dinah was too perfect, too anticipatory, too capable of understanding what Margaret wanted before Margaret herself consciously formed the desire. It suggested a level of observation and intelligence that challenged Margaret's comfortable assumption that enslaved people occupied a mental state somewhere between human and animal, capable of learning through repetition, but lacking true reasoning capacity. Margaret began testing Dinah with more complex instructions, looking for the limit of the girl's comprehension. She would leave books in specific positions and return to find them shelved correctly by subject, without having explained her organizational system. She would mention during dinner conversation that she wished she had a particular dish, and Dinah would somehow communicate the request to the kitchen staff such that the dish appeared at the next meal. She would think about rearranging furniture in her sitting room, and Dinah would begin moving pieces before Margaret issued any verbal instruction. The unease this generated was difficult for Margaret to articulate, even to herself. Her husband dismissed her concerns as female fancy when she tried explaining that Dinah seemed to read minds or predict futures. The other white women in her social circle laughed at the notion that an enslaved girl could possess any capacity for insight that rivaled their own. But Margaret's discomfort persisted and grew, manifesting as a desire to have Dinah out of her immediate presence, to sell the girl to someone else before whatever strangeness she embodied could fully develop into something Margaret could not control. When the opportunity arose to sell Dinah at a premium price to a Montgomery merchant's wife who wanted a trained lady's maid, Margaret urged her husband to accept the offer, despite Dinah's increasing value to their household's operations. Thomas Coalfield, who valued his wife's peace of mind more than he valued a single enslaved worker regardless of competence, agreed to the sale, and Dinah's trajectory toward her first killing began. The sale that separated mother and daughter. When Dinah turned 13 years old, her owner Thomas Caulfield made a business decision that would set in motion a chain of deaths that stretched across a decade. A cotton merchant from Montgomery named Harrison Blackwell had visited Oakwood Plantation to negotiate a purchase of the season's crop, and his wife, accompanying him on the journey, had noticed Dinah serving dinner with a grace and silence that suggested exceptional training. Mrs. Blackwell wanted Dinah as her personal lady's maid, and Harrison Blackwell offered $600 for the girl, a premium price that Thomas Caulfield found impossible to refuse despite his wife's protests that separating Dinah from her mother would cause unnecessary suffering. The transaction was completed in the Oakwood study over glasses of imported brandy, the men discussing terms while Dinah stood in the corner awaiting instructions, her face revealing nothing of the calculations occurring behind eyes that had learned to reflect only compliance. The sale would be finalized within the week, Blackwell explained, allowing time for Dinah to gather whatever possessions she owned, and for the Caulfields to train a replacement for household duties that Dinah had been performing. Margaret Caulfield felt relief rather than guilt, satisfied that the unease Dinah generated would depart with the girl herself. Ruth learned of the sale that evening when Dinah returned to the quarters after completing her duties in the main house. The news came not from Dinah, who maintained her characteristic silence, but from another enslaved woman who had overheard the transaction discussed by the Caulfield household staff. Ruth had known this moment was inevitable, had understood since Dinah's birth that any child born into slavery would eventually be sold or traded or given away. That maternal bonds meant nothing to people who viewed human beings as liquid assets to be deployed however profit demanded. But understanding inevitability did not diminish the grief that felt like physical violence, like something vital being torn from her body while she remained conscious and unable to resist. Ruth had already lost 4 children to sale, 2 daughters sent to plantations in Mississippi before they turned 10, 1 son sold to a rice operation in Georgia, another son dead from fever at age 7. Dinah was the second youngest of her surviving children, the quietest, the strangest, but also the one Ruth had hoped might escape the worst of slavery's brutalities through her very unremarkability. The week before Dinah's departure passed with a speed that felt like cruelty itself. Each evening in the quarters waited with unspoken farewells and advice Ruth desperately wanted to impart, but could not articulate. How do you prepare a 13-year-old girl for the realities of serving in a household where she would have no family, no protection, no one to turn to when inevitable violence arrived? How do you warn her about the particular dangers that enslaved women faced from white men who understood that law and custom permitted them access to black bodies without consequence? Ruth tried to speak these warnings in the careful language that enslaved people developed to communicate vital information, without attracting attention from overseers who monitored their conversations. But Dinah's silence made it difficult to determine whether the girl understood, whether the warnings registered, whether any maternal wisdom could possibly prepare a child for what awaited her in Montgomery. On the morning of Dinah's departure, Ruth held her daughter for the final time into the pre-dawn darkness before work commenced, breathing in the smell of the girl's hair and skin, trying to memorize every physical detail against the certainty that they would never see each other again. Dinah remained silent in her mother's arms, her body still and unresponsive, but just before she pulled away to join Harrison Blackwell in the wagon that would transport her to Montgomery, she whispered 5 words that Ruth would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. I will remember who did this. The first master, who died mysteriously. Harrison Blackwell's household in Montgomery operated with the mechanical precision that successful merchants demanded from their domestic staff. Dinah adapted to her new position with an efficiency that pleased Mrs. Blackwell, performing her duties with silent competence while maintaining the emotional distance that survival required. For 11 months, she served the Blackwell family without incident, learning the rhythms of their household, observing their habits, and noting the particular cruelty that Harrison Blackwell exhibited toward enslaved workers who failed to meet his exacting standards. Then on August 3, 1839, Harrison Blackwell failed to wake for his morning business appointments, and what the doctor discovered when he examined the body would establish a pattern that authorities would not recognize for years. The discovery came at 7:30 in the morning, when Mrs. Blackwell, alarmed that her husband had not appeared for breakfast, and concerned that he would miss a crucial meeting with investors arriving from Mobile, sent Dinah to wake him. Dinah knocked on the bedroom door with appropriate deference, waited for response that did not come, knocked again with increased volume, and finally reported to Mrs. Blackwell that the master was not responding to attempts to rouse him. Mrs. Blackwell approached the door herself, calling her husband's name with increasing urgency, and when silence persisted, she retrieved the spare key that Harrison kept in his study for emergencies. The door unlocked easily, the bolt not engaged from inside, and Mrs. Blackwell entered to find her husband lying in bed with an expression of such profound peace that for a moment she thought he was simply sleeping more deeply than usual. But Harrison Blackwell was not sleeping. He was dead, his body already cooling in the Alabama heat, his face composed and showing no signs of the distress or pain that typically accompanied sudden death. Mrs. Blackwell's screams brought the household staff running, including Dinah, who stood at the doorway observing the scene with her characteristic silence, while other servants wailed and exclaimed over the tragedy. Dr. Samuel Pritchard arrived within the hour, summoned by a messenger who had been sent running to fetch him the moment Mrs. Blackwell confirmed that her husband was beyond waking. Pritchard conducted his examination with the professional detachment of someone who had seen death many times in many forms, noting the absence of visible trauma, the peaceful positioning of the body, the lack of any evidence suggesting struggle or violence. The bedroom itself offered no clues to suggest anything other than natural death. The windows were closed and latched from inside, the room having been secured the previous evening, when Harrison retired at his usual hour of 10 o'clock. No possessions appeared disturbed, no valuables were missing, no signs of intrusion or disturbance marred the orderly space that reflected Harrison's personality even in death. Dr. Pritchard's official determination, recorded in the death certificate filed with Montgomery County Records, attributed Harrison Blackwell's demise to heart failure, a diagnosis that satisfied everyone who needed to be satisfied. Harrison had been 43 years old, in apparently good health, but sudden cardiac death in men of middle age was not uncommon, particularly among those whose business dealings generated the kind of stress that Pritchard believed contributed to such failures. The funeral was held 3 days later at the Presbyterian church that the Blackwells attended, a service attended by Montgomery's merchant class and prominent citizens, who came to pay respects to a man who had been instrumental in building the city's commercial prosperity. Mrs. Blackwell received condolences with appropriate grief, and life continued with the adjustments that widowhood demanded. Dinah served at the funeral reception with her usual silent efficiency, passing among mourners with trays of food and drink, observing the social performance of grief while revealing nothing of her own thoughts. No one noticed her particularly. No one remarked on her demeanor or questioned whether the quiet girl who had served Harrison Blackwell for 11 months might know something about his death that the doctor had not discovered. And why would they notice? She was property, furniture, a tool that performed assigned functions without possessing the capacity for independent action that murder required. The notion that Dinah could have killed Harrison Blackwell was literally unthinkable to people whose entire worldview depended on believing that enslaved people occupied a state of permanent childlike dependence, incapable of complex planning or deliberate violence against white authority. The doctor who missed the evidence. Dr. Samuel Pritchard had been treating Montgomery's wealthy families for 30 years, had certified hundreds of death reports, and had developed a professional detachment that allowed him to perform examinations without excessive curiosity about circumstances that might implicate powerful families in scandal. When he examined Harrison Blackwell's body on that August morning, he noted the peaceful expression, the absence of visible trauma, the relaxed posture suggesting death had come during sleep. He attributed the death to heart failure, a diagnosis that satisfied the widow and required no uncomfortable investigation into whether household security had been compromised. But what Dr. Pritchard missed, or perhaps chose not to see, were subtle indicators that suggested Harrison Blackwell's death was not as natural as it appeared. The faint petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, barely visible without close examination, that suggested oxygen deprivation. The slight discoloration around the lips that might indicate suffocation. The positioning of the body, too perfectly arranged to be entirely natural, suggesting someone had adjusted the corpse after death to create the appearance of peaceful sleep. Pritchard was not incompetent. His medical training in Philadelphia had been rigorous, his experience extensive, and his diagnostic skills generally adequate for the responsibilities his practice demanded. But he operated within a system that rewarded certain conclusions and punished others, that valued social stability over uncomfortable truths, and that preferred simple explanations to complex investigations that might expose vulnerabilities in the architecture of household security that wealthy families depended upon. The examination of Harrison Blackwell's body took less than 20 minutes, conducted in the bedroom where death had occurred while Mrs. Blackwell waited in the parlor, and household staff whispered among themselves about the tragedy. Pritchard performed the standard checks for obvious causes of death, finding nothing that suggested violence or poison or any of the dramatic explanations that might indicate foul play. He listened to the widow's account of her husband's health history, noting that Harrison had complained occasionally of chest pain after particularly stressful business dealings, and concluded that accumulated stress had likely weakened the heart until it failed during the vulnerable hours of sleep. The death certificate Pritchard prepared and filed with county authorities listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest, a determination that would be replicated in 8 subsequent cases before anyone thought to examine whether a pattern existed. But in 1839, with Harrison Blackwell's body awaiting burial and his widow needing certainty about what had killed her husband, Pritchard's diagnosis provided exactly the closure that everyone desired. What Pritchard never considered, because the thought was so foreign to his understanding of how the world operated, was that an enslaved woman might have the intelligence, opportunity, and motivation to commit murder without leaving evidence that he would recognize. The notion that Dinah, who had served the household for 11 months and who stood among the other servants observing the examination with her characteristic silence, might have suffocated Harrison Blackwell with such skill that death appeared natural, contradicted everything Pritchard believed about the capabilities of enslaved people and the security of white households. If Pritchard had examined the Eustace body with greater care, if he had investigated the faint traces of cotton fiber in Harrison's throat, if he had questioned why the bedroom door was unlocked when Mrs. Blackwell claimed her husband always secured it at night, he might have discovered the truth that would only become apparent years later, after multiple deaths established a pattern too obvious to ignore. But in August 1839, standing in Harrison Blackwell's bedroom while the man's widow wept in the next room, Dr. Samuel Pritchard saw what he expected to see and certified a natural death that was anything but natural, allowing the most successful serial killer in Alabama history to escape detection and continue her work. The widow who sold her too quickly. Mrs. Elizabeth Blackwell's decision to liquidate most of her husband's property within 6 weeks of his death struck some observers as hasty. But widows in 1839 Alabama possessed limited options for maintaining households and financial independence. The enslaved workers were sold at auction, the business interest transferred to Harrison's brother, and the Montgomery house converted to rental property that would provide Elizabeth modest but reliable income. Dinah was purchased by a plantation owner named William Hendricks for $550, a slight discount from what Harrison had paid, and Elizabeth felt relief, rather than regret, at seeing the silent girl depart, though she could not have articulated why Dinah's continued presence made her increasingly uncomfortable. The discomfort had begun almost immediately after Harrison's death, manifesting as a vague unease whenever Elizabeth found herself alone with Dinah, in rooms where the girl performed her duties. There was nothing overtly threatening in Dinah's behavior, no changes in the competent service she provided, no violations of the careful protocols that governed interactions between mistress and enslaved servant. Yet Elizabeth found herself avoiding prolonged contact, finding reasons to dismiss Dinah from tasks that required proximity, and experiencing relief when the girl departed each evening to the servants' quarters behind the main house. Elizabeth had tried to explain this unease to her sister Martha, who visited frequently in the weeks after Harrison's death to provide companionship and support. But the words never came out correctly, never captured the specific quality of discomfort that Dinah generated. How could Elizabeth articulate that an enslaved girl's silence felt threatening rather than appropriately submissive? How could she explain that Dinah's competence seemed calculated rather than natural, as if the girl were performing service rather than embodying it? Martha had dismissed Elizabeth's concerns as grief manifesting in unexpected ways, as the emotional instability that widowhood created in even the most stalwart women. Mourning did strange things to perception, Martha explained, making the familiar seem foreign and the harmless seem dangerous. Elizabeth would feel better once she adjusted to life without Harrison, once the initial shock of loss transformed into the more manageable sadness of permanent absence. But Elizabeth's unease was not grief distorting her judgment. It was something more primitive, an instinctive recognition of danger that her conscious mind could not process because it contradicted everything she had been taught about the nature of enslaved people and their incapacity for complex deception. On some level that Elizabeth could not access through rational thought, she understood that Dinah was dangerous, that the girl's presence threatened her in ways that had nothing to do with ordinary concerns about theft or incompetence. The decision to sell Dinah came during a particularly sleepless night 3 weeks after Harrison's death, when Elizabeth lay awake listening to the ordinary sounds of the household settling for the evening, and found herself unable to stop thinking about Dinah moving through the rooms below, performing the cleaning tasks that household servants completed after the family retired. The thought of Dinah having access to her bedroom while she slept, of the girl entering with the master key that all house servants possessed to perform their early morning duties, filled Elizabeth with terror that she could not rationally justify, but could not dismiss. The next morning, Elizabeth informed Harrison's brother that she wanted all of the household staff sold as quickly as possible, that maintaining the Montgomery residence with its full complement of servants was financially impractical for a widow with no business to operate. The brother handled the logistics, arranging the auction and sale that would liquidate Harrison's human property at market prices that reflected the current demand for trained domestic workers. Dinah was sold to William Hendricks on September 19, 1839, exactly 6 weeks after Harrison Blackwell's death. Elizabeth watched the girl depart with relief so profound it felt like physical release, never knowing that her instincts had been absolutely correct, that Dinah had indeed killed Harrison, and that selling the girl would simply transfer the danger to someone else rather than eliminating it. The second death, in a locked room. William Hendricks operated a cotton plantation outside Selma with efficiency built on brutal discipline and careful accounting. He purchased Dinah specifically to serve his invalid wife Catherine, whose declining health required constant attendance, and whose comfort was one of the few remaining pleasures in a marriage long since drained of affection. For 7 months, Dinah attended Catherine with dedicated care, administering medications, changing bedding, reading aloud from improving books when Catherine's strength permitted. William observed this care with approval, noting that the $550 he had invested was proving its value. Then, on March 19, 1840, William Hendricks died in his locked bedroom under circumstances that mirrored Harrison Blackwell's death with precision that should have triggered investigation, but somehow did not. The death was discovered by Catherine herself, who had been awake during the night and noticed that William had not emerged from his bedroom at his usual hour of 6 o'clock. Catherine's illness confined her to the main floor of the house, but she sent Dinah upstairs to wake William and remind him that the plantation overseer was scheduled to meet with him at 7 to discuss planting schedules for the upcoming season. Dinah ascended the stairs with her characteristic silence, approached William's bedroom door, and knocked with appropriate deference. When no response came, she knocked again, louder, and called William's name with the minimum volume required to wake someone sleeping heavily. Still no response. Dinah returned to Catherine and reported that the master was not answering, and Catherine, with growing concern, instructed Dinah to try the door to determine if William had perhaps overslept or become ill during the night. But when Dinah returned upstairs and tried the door, she found it locked, the bolt engaged from inside in the manner that William habitually secured his room each evening. The locked door suggested William was inside and had chosen not to respond, though this seemed unlike his usual punctuality and regard for scheduled meetings. Dinah reported this finding to Catherine, who now demanded that the overseer be summoned immediately to force the door if necessary. The overseer, a man named Jackson who had worked the Hendricks plantation for 12 years, arrived within minutes and assessed the situation with the practical approach of someone accustomed to solving problems through force. He threw his weight against the bedroom door twice before the lock mechanism gave way, and the door burst open, revealing William Hendricks lying peacefully in his bed, appearing for all the world as if he were simply sleeping late. But William Hendricks was dead, his body positioned with such perfect symmetry that it seemed deliberately arranged, his face composed in an expression of calm that suggested death had arrived without warning or struggle. The room showed no signs of disturbance. The windows were secured from inside, and nothing appeared missing or out of place. The plantation doctor, summoned from town, arrived 2 hours later and conducted an examination that lasted barely longer than the one Dr. Pritchard had performed on Harrison Blackwell 7 months earlier. The doctor noted the absence of trauma, the peaceful expression, the lack of any obvious cause of death, and concluded that William Hendricks had likely suffered heart failure during sleep, a diagnosis that required no further investigation and generated no uncomfortable questions about household security. Catherine Hendricks, devastated by the loss of her husband and concerned about her own future as an invalid widow with no means of managing a plantation, never thought to question whether the enslaved woman who had been caring for her with such dedication might have killed William. The notion was unthinkable, impossible, contrary to every assumption about the nature of enslaved people and their capacity for violence against white authority. And so Dinah remained in the Hendricks household for another 6 weeks, continuing to care for Catherine until the estate could be settled and arrangements made for Catherine to move in with her sister's family in Mobile. Then Dinah was sold again, this time to a planter named Robert Morrison, and the pattern continued, invisible to everyone except the killer herself, who moved from household to household like a plague no one could recognize until it had already claimed its victims. The pattern no one recognized. The statistical improbability of 2 healthy men under 50 dying of apparent heart failure within 8 months. both having recently purchased the same enslaved woman, should have prompted immediate investigation. But Alabama in 1840 operated on assumptions that made certain connections literally unthinkable to those in positions to recognize patterns. The notion that an enslaved woman, particularly one as quiet and compliant as Dinah, could systematically murder white men contradicted every foundational belief that plantation society depended upon. And so William Hendricks's death was recorded as natural causes, and Dinah was sold again, this time to a planter named Robert Morrison for $500. The failure to recognize the pattern was not merely oversight or incompetence, though both played roles in allowing Dinah's murders to continue undetected. Rather, it reflected the fundamental cognitive dissonance that slavery required of those who participated in it. White Southerners in the 1840s maintained simultaneously that enslaved people were intellectually inferior to whites, incapable of complex reasoning or abstract thought, while also implementing elaborate systems of control designed to prevent exactly the kind of organized resistance or individual violence that allegedly incapable people should not be able to conceive. County coroners who examined the bodies of Harrison Blackwell and William Hendricks saw what their worldview permitted them to see: natural deaths, unfortunate but explicable through the standard medical understanding of how hearts failed and men died without warning. To see anything else would require acknowledging that enslaved people possessed the intelligence, patience, and capability to plan and execute murders that left no evidence, and this acknowledgement would undermine every justification for the system that granted white people absolute power over black bodies. The doctors who certified both deaths never communicated with each other, never compared notes, or discussed whether recent cases shared unusual commonalities. Medical practice in 1840s Alabama operated with professional isolation that prevented the kind of information sharing that might have revealed patterns spanning multiple counties. Each death was examined independently, recorded in separate files that would not be cross-referenced until years later when someone finally thought to look for connections. Even the families of the deceased never made connections that might seem obvious in retrospect. Elizabeth Blackwell, selling Dinah to William Hendricks, never thought to warn the purchaser that her husband had died shortly after acquiring the girl. Why would she? Harrison's death had been certified as natural, and any suggestion that an enslaved woman might have been involved would have seemed like delusional paranoia rather than legitimate concern. The enslaved community, those who worked alongside Dinah in various households, likely had suspicions that white people never heard. Enslaved workers developed sophisticated networks of communication that allowed them to share information about which owners were particularly cruel, which overseers were prone to violence, which plantations offered marginally better conditions than others. Within these networks, Dinah's association with sudden deaths might have been noted, discussed in whispered conversations that took place beyond white observation. But if enslaved people suspected Dinah was killing her owners, they had no incentive to report this information to authorities who would either disbelieve them or punish them for making accusations against valuable property. Some might have viewed Dinah as a hero, as someone exacting vengeance against a system that destroyed families and treated human beings as livestock. Others might have feared her, seeing in her silent competence a capacity for violence that could turn against anyone regardless of color. The pattern remained invisible because those with power to investigate chose not to see, and those who might have spoken had no voice that power was willing to hear. And so Dinah moved from household to household, from victim to victim, protected by the very assumptions about enslaved people's capabilities that she systematically proved false with every murder. The plantation where she learned. A hatred. Robert Morrison's plantation in Lowndes County was where Dinah's silent compliance began concealing something darker than survival instinct. Morrison operated his property with calculated cruelty, using physical punishment as both discipline and entertainment, and he took particular pleasure in the psychological torment of separating enslaved families during his twice-yearly culling of workers he deemed insufficiently productive. In the 9 months Dinah served Morrison's household, she witnessed atrocities that would have broken people less disciplined in concealing emotion, watched children torn from mothers, saw men whipped for the crime of showing grief, and learned that some people's capacity for evil exceeded anything she had previously imagined. Morrison's plantation was larger than the previous properties where Dinah had worked. Over 800 acres of prime cotton land worked by 63 enslaved people, whose labor generated profits that funded Morrison's expensive tastes in imported wines, custom furniture, and the kind of conspicuous consumption that announced wealth to anyone who visited. The plantation house was grander than either the Blackwell residence or the Hendricks property, a 3-story structure with columns that mimicked Greek temples and gardens maintained by workers whose own living quarters lacked floors or windows that closed properly. Dinah was assigned to serve Morrison's wife Eleanor, a woman whose genteel manners and soft-spoken demeanor concealed either willful ignorance or deliberate complicity in her husband's brutality. Eleanor would sip tea in her sitting room, while screams echoed from the whipping post visible through her window, would discuss dinner menus while families were separated on the auction block, would pray each evening for God's blessing on her household, while human beings suffered under conditions she never acknowledged. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain Eleanor's self-image as a Christian woman of refinement, while participating in slavery's daily horrors, was something Dinah observed with the cold attention she brought to everything. Eleanor was not stupid, was not genuinely ignorant of what occurred beyond her immediate line of sight. She chose not to know, actively constructed a version of reality that allowed her to enjoy the material comfort that enslaved labor provided, while avoiding any moral accountability for the violence that produced her privilege. But it was Robert Morrison himself who taught Dinah that some people deserved death not merely as abstract justice, but as practical necessity for preventing further harm. Morrison conducted his twice-yearly cullings in June and December, reviewing the plantation's enslaved population and identifying those whose productivity had declined, whose attitudes showed insufficient deference, or who simply represented liquid capital that could be converted to cash when unexpected expenses arose. The June 1840 culling occurred 3 weeks after Dinah's arrival, before she fully understood Morrison's methods. 7 enslaved people were selected for sale, including a woman named Sarah and her 3 children, the youngest still nursing. Sarah begged Morrison to reconsider, offered to work harder, volunteered to take on additional duties if he would keep her family together. Morrison responded by laughing, by explaining with genuine amusement that Sarah's emotional attachment to her children was touching, but economically irrelevant, that the children would bring better prices if sold separately, to buyers who needed different age categories of workers. Dinah witnessed this scene from her position serving lemonade on the porch where Morrison conducted his business. She watched Sarah's desperation transform into something beyond grief, watched the woman collapse when her children were loaded into the trader's wagon, watched Morrison count the money he received with satisfaction that suggested he had negotiated particularly favorable terms. That night, lying in the servants' quarters behind the main house, Dinah decided that Robert Morrison would die. Not immediately, because immediate violence would make the connection between crime and killer too obvious. But soon, and in a manner that would appear natural, that would generate no investigation or pursuit. She would kill him as she had killed Harrison Blackwell and William Hendricks, using methods that left no evidence, that allowed her to move on to the next household, the next victim, the next man who thought his power made him invulnerable to judgment from those he enslaved. Robert Morrison had 9 months left to live, though he would never know that his death sentence had been pronounced by a silent girl who served his wife tea and watched everything, with eyes that revealed nothing. The master who died on Christmas Eve, Robert Morrison's death on December 24, 1840, was discovered by his eldest son Charles when the family gathered for Christmas breakfast and Morrison failed to appear. The locked bedroom, the peaceful expression, the absence of any sign of struggle or violence, all matched the pattern that no one was yet tracking. But this death included a detail that would eventually prove significant to investigators. Morrison was found with traces of cotton fiber in his mouth and throat, so fine and deeply embedded that the examining doctor noted it in his report, before attributing it to Morrison's habit of chewing tobacco wrapped in cotton lint. The Christmas morning discovery transformed what should have been a celebration into a scene of grief and confusion that spread through the Morrison household with the speed of catastrophe. Charles Morrison had been first to notice his father's absence from the breakfast table, had waited 15 minutes before growing concerned enough to investigate, and had found the bedroom door locked as usual but receiving no response to increasingly urgent knocking. The overseer was summoned to force the door, just as had happened at the Hendricks plantation 9 months earlier. The lock gave way after 2 forceful strikes, and Charles entered to find his father lying in bed with an expression of such profound peace that for a moment Charles thought perhaps Morrison had simply overslept, had perhaps drunk too much brandy the previous evening, and fallen into sleep so deep that normal sounds could not penetrate it. But Robert Morrison was not sleeping. He was dead, his body already cooling, his face composed in the serene expression that Dinah had learned to create by arranging her victims after the suffocation was complete, positioning them carefully to suggest natural death during sleep, rather than violent struggle against someone stealing their breath. The doctor who examined Morrison's body was named Thomas Fletcher, and unlike his colleagues who had certified the previous deaths, Fletcher was thorough to the point of obsessiveness, convinced that careful observation could reveal truths that hasty examinations missed. He spent nearly an hour with Morrison's corpse, noting every detail, recording observations that included the cotton fibers he discovered when he opened Morrison's mouth to check for obstructions. The fibers were fine, almost invisible, embedded in the tissue of Morrison's throat in ways that suggested they had been there when he died rather than introduced afterward. Fletcher noted this finding in his report, describing the fibers' location and appearance, but ultimately concluded that they were consistent with Morrison's known habit of chewing tobacco wrapped in cotton lint, a practice common among planters who found it enhanced the tobacco's flavor and reduced its harshness. What Fletcher did not realize, what he could not have realized without knowing about the previous deaths and their similar circumstances, was that these cotton fibers were evidence of murder rather than mundane habit. Dinah had suffocated Robert Morrison using a technique she had perfected through practice, holding cotton batting over his nose and mouth with pressure calibrated to prevent struggle, maintaining the suffocation until his body went still and his heartbeat ceased. The method required patience and precise timing. Too much force would create bruising that doctors might notice. Too little force would allow the victim to wake and fight back, creating noise that would alert the household and ruin everything. Dinah had learned through her first 2 killings exactly how much pressure to apply, how long to maintain it, how to recognize the moment when resistance ceased and death arrived. Robert Morrison's funeral was held on December 27th, a subdued affair that reflected the family's shock at losing their patriarch during what should have been a joyous holiday celebration. Eleanor Morrison, devastated by grief, barely noticed when the household staff was sold 3 weeks later to settle the estate's debts. Dinah was purchased by a planter named Thomas Yancey for $450, the discount reflecting growing whispers among planters that the girl might carry some kind of curse, that men who owned her seemed to die with disturbing frequency, though no one quite dared to articulate the full implication of this pattern. The investigator who finally noticed James Whitfield had been elected county coroner in Lowndes County in 1838, and unlike his predecessor, he maintained meticulous records of every death he examined, categorizing them by apparent cause, age of deceased, and circumstances of discovery. By early 1841, Whitfield had accumulated enough data to notice a disturbing pattern, an unusual cluster of deaths among plantation owners, all attributed to natural causes, all occurring during sleep in locked rooms. When he began cross-referencing estate records to identify commonalities among the deceased, he discovered Dinah's name appearing with frequency that could not be coincidental. The discovery came during a routine review of his files in February 1841, when Whitfield was preparing an annual report for the county commissioners on mortality statistics and causes of death. He had been organizing his records chronologically, noting trends in disease, accidents, and natural deaths, when something caught his attention. 3 plantation owners within a 50-mile radius had died during sleep in locked rooms within 18 months. The statistical probability of such a cluster seemed unlikely enough to warrant closer examination. Whitfield began pulling estate records from the county clerk's office, looking for connections between the deceased men beyond their apparent cause of death. What he found was Dinah's name appearing in purchase records for each victim. Harrison Blackwell had bought her in 1838. William Hendricks purchased her in 1839. Robert Morrison acquired her in 1840. Each man died within months of the purchase under identical circumstances that had been certified as natural causes. The pattern suggested something impossible, something that contradicted every assumption about enslaved people's capabilities and the security of white households. But Whitfield was methodical enough to trust data over assumptions, and the data suggested that an enslaved woman was systematically murdering her owners in ways that left no evidence doctors could recognize. Whitfield expanded his investigation beyond Lowndes County, sending inquiries to coroners in surrounding jurisdictions, asking whether they had recorded similar deaths among plantation owners in recent years. 2 responses provided additional connections. A planter in Montgomery County had died in 1839 under circumstances matching the pattern, and estate records showed he had owned an enslaved woman named Dinah. Another death in Dallas County in 1840 showed the same characteristics. By March 1841, Whitfield had documented 5 deaths connected to the same enslaved woman, all occurring during sleep in locked rooms, all certified as natural causes by doctors who found no evidence of violence or foul play. The statistical impossibility of coincidence was overwhelming. Dinah was killing her owners, using methods so sophisticated that they left no physical evidence that 19th-century medical examination could detect. But proving murder required more than statistical correlation. Whitfield needed physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, or a confession that could support criminal prosecution. And he needed to act quickly, because Dinah had recently been sold again, this time to a planter named Thomas Yancey, which meant another man's life was in immediate danger. Whitfield prepared a confidential report for the county sheriff, detailing his findings and recommending immediate surveillance of the Yancey household to prevent what he believed would be the 6th murder in Dinah's campaign of systematic vengeance against those who enslaved her. The trap they could not set James Whitfield's preliminary findings, presented to a closed meeting of county officials in February 1841, created immediate panic among plantation owners who realized they might be harboring a serial killer in their own households. But the evidence Whitfield had compiled was entirely circumstantial, and the logistics of proving that an enslaved woman was systematically murdering her owners presented obstacles that 19th-century law enforcement lacked the sophistication to overcome. How could they set a trap when the victims died in locked rooms with no witnesses? How could they conduct surveillance without revealing their suspicions and prompting the killer to flee or change methods? The meeting took place in the Lowndes County Courthouse on February 18th, attended by the sheriff, 3 county commissioners, Whitfield himself, and 5 plantation owners whose properties bordered the Yancey plantation, where Dinah now worked. Whitfield presented his findings with clinical precision, showing the correlation between Dinah's employment and the deaths of 5 men, describing the identical circumstances of each death, and arguing that the pattern eliminated coincidence as a plausible explanation. The initial reaction was skepticism, bordering on hostility. The notion that an enslaved woman could commit murder without leaving evidence struck several attendees as impossible, contradicting everything they believed about the intellectual inferiority of enslaved people and the security measures that protected white households. One commissioner argued that Whitfield was seeing patterns where none existed, that natural deaths sometimes clustered in ways that appeared suspicious but reflected nothing more than unfortunate timing. But Whitfield had anticipated this resistance and came prepared with additional data. He had researched mortality rates among plantation owners across Alabama for the previous decade, establishing baseline statistics that showed how rarely healthy men under 50 died suddenly during sleep. The cluster of deaths connected to Dinah represented a statistical anomaly so extreme that attributing it to coincidence required willful blindness rather than reasonable skepticism. The sheriff, a pragmatic man named William Crawford who valued evidence over ideology, eventually sided with Whitfield's interpretation. The pattern was real, the danger was immediate, and Thomas Yancey needed to be warned that the woman serving his household had likely killed her previous 5 owners. But warning Yancey created its own problems. If Dinah suspected she had been identified, she might flee, and pursuing an escaped slave across state lines was difficult under the best circumstances, nearly impossible when the fugitive had months of head start. The group debated various approaches to surveillance and investigation. Several suggested placing observers in the Yancey household under the pretense of conducting a census or tax assessment. But this would require Yancey's cooperation and might alert Dinah to the scrutiny. Others proposed arresting Dinah immediately on suspicion of murder, but without physical evidence or witnesses, conviction would be nearly impossible, and false arrest of valuable property could trigger legal liability. What the meeting ultimately revealed was how unprepared Alabama's law enforcement system was to handle a killer who operated with Dinah's sophistication and patience. The systems designed to control enslaved people assumed that resistance would be overt, violent, and easily identifiable. They had no framework for addressing someone who killed quietly, leaving no evidence, moving from victim to victim under the protection of assumptions about enslaved people's incapacity for complex planning. The master who bought her anyway. Thomas Yancey's decision to purchase Dinah in March 1841, despite whispered warnings from other planters about the suspicious deaths surrounding her previous owners, demonstrated either extraordinary courage or fatal arrogance. Yancey dismissed the concerns as superstitious nonsense, arguing that enslaved women lacked both the intelligence and opportunity to commit murder without detection. He paid $450 for Dinah, confident that proper supervision would prevent any theoretical danger, and assigned her to work under the direct oversight of his wife Rebecca, who shared none of her husband's certainty. The warnings had come from Robert Morrison's widow Eleanor, who had heard rumors about the pattern of deaths and felt obligated to mention them when she learned that Yancey was considering purchasing Dinah from the estate sale. Eleanor's warning was vague, hedged with qualifications and uncertainty, because she herself was not entirely sure what she believed. Perhaps the deaths were coincidence. Perhaps they reflected some curse or supernatural influence rather than deliberate murder. But perhaps, and this was the possibility that terrified Eleanor in ways she could barely acknowledge, Dinah had somehow killed the men who owned her. Thomas Yancey had listened to Eleanor's concerns with the patronizing patience that successful men reserve for women's irrational fears. He explained that natural deaths occurred with regularity among men of middle age, that stress and overwork contributed to heart failure regardless of what servants happened to be employed in the household, and that attributing such deaths to an enslaved woman required believing that property could systematically outwit owners without leaving evidence that doctors and investigators could detect. The price Yancey paid for Dinah reflected the market's uncertainty about whether the warnings had merit. At $450, she was selling for significantly less than the $600 Harrison Blackwell had paid 3 years earlier, the discount suggesting that other potential buyers shared Eleanor Morrison's unease even if they dismissed her specific concerns. But Yancey viewed the discount as opportunity rather than warning, acquiring a trained domestic worker at a bargain price because other planters were too superstitious to recognize value. Dinah arrived at the Yancey plantation on March 23, 1841, transported from the Morrison estate sale by wagon and delivered to Rebecca Yancey, who received her with visible apprehension. Rebecca had heard the same rumors her husband dismissed, but unlike Thomas, she trusted her instincts about danger, even when she could not rationally explain their source. There was something about Dinah that generated unease, something in the girl's silence and stillness that suggested hidden depths Rebecca did not want to explore. Thomas Yancey's confidence persisted through the first month of Dinah's employment, bolstered by the girl's competent performance of assigned duties and the absence of any signs that might justify concern. He told Rebecca repeatedly that her fears were groundless, that Dinah was simply an exceptionally well-trained servant, whose silence reflected proper deference rather than sinister calculation. But Thomas Yancey would be dead within 4 months, and his final thoughts, in the moments before Dinah's cotton batting stole his breath, would be recognition that his wife had been right all along. The wife who tried to warn him. Rebecca Yancey's unease about Dinah began within days of the woman's arrival and intensified into conviction that something was profoundly wrong. There was nothing overtly suspicious in Dinah's behavior, no violations of protocol or failures of duty. Yet Rebecca found herself unable to sleep soundly, knowing that Dinah moved through their house at night, performing the cleaning and preparation tasks that household servants completed when the family slept. She tried multiple times to convince Thomas to sell Dinah, to admit that the warnings might have merit. But Thomas interpreted his wife's concerns as female hysteria and refused to discuss the matter further. The first incident that crystallized Rebecca's fear occurred 2 weeks after Dinah's arrival. Rebecca had been awakened in the night by a sound she could not identify, a disturbance so faint it barely registered as noise but which pulled her from sleep with sudden alertness. She lay in her bed listening, hearing nothing but the ordinary sounds of the house settling and the wind moving through trees outside. Then she saw Dinah passing in the hallway, visible through the partially open bedroom door, moving with such silence that Rebecca understood the sound that woke her had not been Dinah's footsteps, but rather some instinctive alarm that sensed danger even when conscious perception detected nothing wrong. Rebecca mentioned this incident to Thomas the following morning, describing how Dinah had been moving through the house in the middle of the night with no apparent purpose since cleaning tasks were completed in the evening. Thomas explained patiently that household servants often worked irregular hours, that Dinah might have been checking fires or securing windows or performing any number of legitimate duties that required moving through the house after the family retired. But Rebecca's unease persisted and grew. She began watching Dinah more carefully, observing the girl's interactions with other household staff, noting the reactions she generated. The other enslaved workers seemed wary of Dinah, maintaining distance that suggested more than ordinary social hierarchy. They would not meet her eyes, would not engage in the casual conversation that typically occurred among workers during brief respites from supervision. The avoidance seemed deliberate, as if they knew something about Dinah that Rebecca did not, as if they recognized danger that white people were too arrogant to perceive. Rebecca tried again to convince Thomas to sell Dinah, this time presenting her observations about how other enslaved workers behaved around the girl. Thomas dismissed this evidence as easily as he had dismissed everything else, arguing that enslaved people's social dynamics were inscrutable to white observers, and that reading significance into their behavior was pointless speculation. The final attempt Rebecca made to warn Thomas came in early July, less than 2 weeks before his death. She told him directly that she believed Dinah had killed her previous owners, that the pattern of deaths was too consistent to be coincidence, that they needed to remove her from their household immediately. Thomas responded with anger rather than consideration, accusing Rebecca of allowing fear to override reason, of insulting his judgment by persisting with concerns he had repeatedly addressed. Thomas Yancey died on July 12th, and Rebecca would spend the rest of her life knowing she had been right. The death that finally proved the pattern. When Thomas Yancey died on July 12, 1841, in his locked bedroom with cotton fibers embedded so deeply in his throat that the examining doctor could not extract them all, James Whitfield finally had the evidence he needed to force an official investigation. The pattern was undeniable. The physical evidence suggested suffocation disguised as natural death, and Dinah's connection to all 6 victims could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Within hours of completing his examination, Whitfield issued a warrant for Dinah's arrest, mobilizing slave patrols to prevent her escape, and preparing to build a case that would expose the most successful serial killer in Alabama's history. Whitfield had been monitoring the Yancey household since presenting his findings to county officials in February, maintaining distant surveillance that attempted to document Dinah's movements without alerting her to the scrutiny. When word reached him on the morning of July 12th that Thomas Yancey had been found dead, Whitfield arrived at the plantation within an hour, bringing with him the files he had compiled on the previous deaths and a determination to conduct the most thorough examination yet. The crime scene was familiar in its details. Thomas Yancey lay in his bed with peaceful expression, the bedroom door locked from inside, no signs of struggle or violence visible to casual observation. But Whitfield was not conducting a casual observation. He examined the body with meticulous attention, noting every detail, documenting everything in writing before allowing the body to be moved or the room to be disturbed. The cotton fibers in Yancey's throat were the physical evidence Whitfield had been seeking, proof that death was not natural despite its peaceful appearance. The fibers were fine cotton batting, the same material used for stuffing pillows and mattresses, pressed so deeply into the throat tissue that extracting them required careful work with forceps. The placement suggested they had been introduced while Yancey was alive, that he had inhaled them or had them forced into his airway during the moments before death. Whitfield documented the fibers' location and appearance, carefully preserved samples for potential use as evidence, and prepared a death report that, for the first time in the series of murders, refused to certify natural causes. The report stated that Thomas Yancey had died of suffocation by person or persons unknown, that physical evidence suggested deliberate murder rather than accidental death, and that immediate investigation was warranted to identify the perpetrator. The warrant for Dinah's arrest was issued within hours, based on Whitfield's documentation of the pattern connecting her to 6 deaths and the physical evidence suggesting murder rather than natural causes. The sheriff mobilized slave patrols to surround the Yancey plantation and prevent escape, though Whitfield suspected that Dinah would not attempt to flee, that her confidence in her methods had grown to the point where she might not believe anyone could prove her guilt. By evening on July 12th, slave patrols were in position around the plantation, and preparations were complete to arrest Dinah the following morning. After 3 years and 6 murders, the most dangerous woman in Alabama was about to be captured, and the evidence that would convict her was finally sufficient to overcome the skepticism that had protected her. The capture in the A.I. quarters. Dinah made no attempt to flee when slave patrols arrived at the Yancey plantation on July 13th to take her into custody. She was found in the quarters where enslaved workers lived, sitting outside one of the cabins with an expression of such profound calm that it unsettled the men who came to arrest her. She offered no resistance, spoke no words of protest or explanation, and walked to the county jail with the same silent compliance that had characterized her service in 6 different households. Her quietness, which had once made her valuable as a servant, now made her terrifying as a prisoner, because silence suggested premeditation and control rather than the passionate criminality that white observers found easier to comprehend. The arrest was conducted by Sheriff William Crawford and 4 deputies, all armed and prepared for potential resistance or escape attempt that never materialized. They found Dinah sitting on a wooden bench outside the cabin she shared with 3 other enslaved women who worked the Yancey household, her hands folded in her lap, her expression revealing nothing of whatever thoughts occupied her mind. Crawford announced that Dinah was under arrest for the murder of Thomas Yancey, and that she would be transported to the county jail to await formal charges and trial. Dinah looked at Crawford with eyes that showed no fear, no surprise, no emotion at all, and simply stood up and walked toward the wagon that would transport her to custody. The other enslaved workers watched this scene in silence, and Crawford could not determine whether their expressions showed relief or concern at Dinah's removal from their midst. The journey to the county jail took 30 minutes, with Dinah sitting in the wagon bed surrounded by armed deputies who maintained constant vigilance despite her apparent passivity. Crawford studied Dinah during this journey, trying to reconcile the quiet young woman before him with the serial killer that evidence suggested she was. There was nothing visibly threatening about her, nothing that suggested capacity for the calculated violence she had allegedly committed. She appeared exactly as she had always appeared, a compliant enslaved woman performing whatever role circumstances demanded. At the jail, Dinah was processed with the bureaucratic efficiency that confinement required. Her name was recorded in the arrest log, her physical description documented, and she was placed in a cell that normally housed enslaved people awaiting punishment or sale. The jailer, a man named Peterson, who had been managing the facility for 12 years, noted that Dinah was the first woman he had ever held on suspicion of murdering her owner, and he implemented special precautions including constant observation and restrictions on who could have access to her. James Whitfield visited Dinah that evening, hoping to conduct an initial interview that might yield confession or at least some acknowledgement of what she had done. But Dinah maintained the silence that had protected her through 3 years of systematic murder. She would not speak, would not acknowledge Whitfield's presence, would not provide any assistance to those seeking to build a case against her. Her silence was absolute, and Whitfield understood that obtaining conviction would require physical evidence and circumstantial connections rather than any admission from the killer herself. The confession she never made. The interrogation of Dinah began on July 14, 1841, and continued for 6 days, conducted by county officials, plantation owners, and a prosecutor, desperate to extract some acknowledgement of guilt that could be used at trial. But Dinah maintained absolute silence, refusing to answer questions, declining to confirm or deny her involvement in any deaths, and showing no emotional response to accusations, threats, or promises of leniency in exchange for cooperation. Her silence was not the defensive posture of someone hiding guilt, but rather the deliberate withholding of someone who understood that power could take everything from her except her refusal to participate in her own destruction. The interrogations took place in a room adjacent to the jail, with Dinah seated at a wooden table while various officials attempted different approaches to breaking her silence. James Whitfield began with calm, methodical questions about her employment history, asking her to confirm that she had worked for Harrison Blackwell, William Hendricks, Robert Morrison, and Thomas Yancey. Dinah stared at the wall behind Whitfield and said nothing. The prosecutor, a man named Harrison Tucker who had never tried a case involving an enslaved person accused of murdering multiple white men, attempted a more aggressive approach. He described in detail how each victim had died, recounted the physical evidence found in their throats, accused Dinah directly of suffocating them while they slept. Dinah's expression never changed. Her eyes never wavered from their fixed focus on the wall. Her breathing remained steady and calm. Several plantation owners who attended the interrogations tried appeals to religion, suggesting that confession would provide spiritual redemption, even if it resulted in earthly punishment. They quoted scripture about truth and salvation, about the burden that guilty secrets imposed on the soul, about God's willingness to forgive even the gravest sins if genuine repentance accompanied acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Dinah showed no response to these appeals, no sign that religious considerations influenced her calculus about whether to speak. The interrogators tried promising leniency, suggesting that cooperation might result in reduced sentences or transportation rather than execution. They tried threatening torture, describing punishments that could be inflicted to extract confession if voluntary admission was not forthcoming. They tried manipulating her through fabricated claims that other enslaved workers had provided testimony implicating her in the murders. None of these approaches generated any response beyond Dinah's continued silence. By the 6th day of interrogation, the officials conducting the questioning had exhausted their strategies and accepted that Dinah would provide no assistance to the prosecution's case. Her silence would persist through trial, through sentencing, through the final moments before execution. She would die without ever confirming or denying what everyone believed she had done, without explaining her methods or motivations, without providing the closure that confession typically offered to those seeking to understand criminal behavior. The prosecutor would be forced to build his case entirely on circumstantial evidence and physical findings, connecting Dinah to the victims through employment records and linking the deaths through their common characteristics. It would be sufficient for conviction, because Alabama juries in 1841 required little evidence to find enslaved defendants guilty of crimes against white victims. But Dinah's silence meant that certain questions would remain forever unanswered. The trial that exposed everything. The legal proceedings against Dinah, conducted in August 1841 in the Lowndes County Courthouse, revealed contradictions in slavery's legal architecture that made prosecutors and defense attorneys alike uncomfortable. Dinah was property under Alabama law, yet she was being tried as a criminal defendant, a status that theoretically granted her rights that enslaved people did not possess. The trial became a forum for examining not just her alleged crimes, but the system that had created the circumstances in which those crimes occurred, forcing uncomfortable testimony about how enslaved people were bought, sold, separated from families, and subjected to violence that the law sanctioned, but that jury members found increasingly difficult to defend. The trial opened on August 16th before Judge William Matthews, a man who had presided over Alabama courts for 23 years and who understood that this case carried implications far beyond the guilt or innocence of a single defendant. The courthouse was packed with spectators, plantation owners, and their families occupying the best seats, with standing room filled by townspeople curious to witness a trial that newspaper coverage had transformed into regional sensation. Prosecutor Harrison Tucker opened with a methodical presentation of the circumstantial evidence connecting Dinah to 6 deaths spanning 3 years. He presented employment records showing that Dinah had worked for each victim in the months before they died. He called coroners who described the identical circumstances of each death: men dying during sleep in locked rooms, bodies positioned peacefully, no signs of struggle or violence visible to initial examination. James Whitfield provided the crucial testimony about the cotton fibers found in Thomas Yancey's throat, describing their placement and characteristics, explaining why he believed they represented evidence of suffocation rather than accidental inhalation. Whitfield acknowledged under cross-examination that the earlier deaths had not been examined with sufficient thoroughness to determine whether similar fibers were present. But he argued that the pattern of deaths combined with the physical evidence from Yancey's body established proof beyond reasonable doubt that murder had occurred. The defense attorney, appointed by the court because enslaved defendants lacked resources to retain private counsel, was a young lawyer named Robert Davidson, who understood that winning was impossible, but that providing adequate representation required challenging the prosecution's narrative. Davidson focused on the absence of direct evidence, the lack of witnesses, the impossibility of proving beyond reasonable doubt that Dinah had committed the murders rather than merely being present in households where natural deaths occurred, with unlikely frequency. But Davidson's most effective strategy was forcing prosecution witnesses to describe the conditions under which enslaved people lived and worked. He asked coroners to explain why they had initially certified natural causes for deaths they now claimed were murders. He questioned plantation owners about their treatment of enslaved workers, about the violence and family separations that characterized the system. He made the jury confront uncomfortable truths about the society they participated in, suggesting that if Dinah had killed her owners, perhaps the real question was not whether she deserved punishment, but whether the men who enslaved her had deserved death. The strategy was morally compelling, but legally insufficient. The jury would convict, and Dinah would hang. But Davidson ensured that the trial record contained testimony about slavery's brutalities that would survive long after the verdict was rendered. The sentence that surprised no one. The jury's verdict, delivered after less than 2 hours of deliberation on August 23, 1841, surprised no one who understood how Alabama justice functioned when enslaved people were accused of harming white victims. Dinah was found guilty of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to death by hanging, the execution scheduled for September 15th, to allow time for appeals that everyone knew would not materialize. The verdict was legally questionable, built on circumstantial evidence and motivated by need to restore white confidence in their ability to control enslaved populations. But legal precision mattered less than symbolic demonstration that the system could punish those who challenged it. Judge Matthews read the verdict without visible emotion, maintaining the judicial detachment that his position required, even in cases that generated strong public feeling. He asked Dinah if she had anything to say before sentence was pronounced, offering her the final opportunity to speak, that legal protocol demanded. Dinah remained silent, standing before the court with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the trial, showing no response to the verdict that would end her life. The sentence Matthews imposed was execution by hanging, to be carried out in public view as a warning to other enslaved people about the consequences of violence against white authority. Matthews specified that Dinah would be transported to the county gallows on September 15th at noon, that she would be provided opportunity for spiritual counsel in the days before execution, and that her body would be buried in the county cemetery section reserved for executed criminals rather than returned to any plantation for private burial. The courtroom erupted in conversation when Matthews finished reading the sentence, spectators discussing the verdict and expressing satisfaction that justice had been served. Several plantation owners who had attended the trial approached the prosecutor to congratulate him on securing conviction, despite the circumstantial nature of the evidence. The defense attorney gathered his papers in silence and departed quickly, understanding that his efforts to humanize Dinah and contextualize her alleged crimes had failed to generate mercy from a jury committed to maintaining social order through violent example. Dinah was returned to her cell to await execution, and the 23 days between sentencing and scheduled death would be filled with visits from ministers hoping to secure her confession and religious conversion before she faced judgment. But Dinah would provide these ministers no more cooperation than she had provided interrogators and prosecutors. She would maintain her silence until the moment the rope tightened around her neck, taking with her whatever thoughts and feelings had motivated 3 years of systematic murder. The verdict generated newspaper coverage across Alabama and into neighboring states, with some papers praising the conviction as evidence that law and order could prevail even when criminals were cunning enough to leave minimal evidence. Other papers, particularly those published in northern states where abolitionist sentiment was growing, used Dinah's case to argue that slavery created conditions that inevitably generated violence, that treating human beings as property produced resentment that sometimes expressed itself through the only means available to the powerless: secret patient revenge that exploited the very assumptions of superiority that slaveholders used to justify their dominance. The files that revealed 4 more victims. After Dinah's execution on September 15, 1841, conducted before a crowd of over 300 witnesses who came to see justice delivered to a woman who had terrorized Alabama's planter class, James Whitfield continued his investigation into deaths that might be connected to her. What he discovered in plantation records and estate documents was evidence that the 5 murders for which Dinah was convicted represented only part of her actual body count. 4 additional plantation owners had died under suspicious circumstances after purchasing or trading for enslaved women whose descriptions matched Dinah, deaths that occurred before Whitfield began tracking the pattern, suggesting that her campaign of silent vengeance had been operating far longer than anyone had realized. The discovery came through systematic review of estate records and death certificates across 5 counties for the period between 1836 and 1841. Whitfield had been commissioned by the county to conduct this investigation after Dinah's trial revealed how many deaths had gone unexamined, and he approached the task with the methodical attention to detail that had allowed him to identify the initial pattern. 3 of the additional deaths occurred in 1837 and early 1838, before Harrison Blackwell purchased Dinah in March 1838. Estate records showed that a planter named Jonathan Pierce had owned an enslaved woman named Dinah, who was sold after his death in June 1837. Another planter named Samuel Crawford died in November 1837, and his estate sale included an enslaved woman matching Dinah's description. A third planter named Henry Moss died in February 1838, just 1 month before Harrison Blackwell's purchase, and his estate records listed Dinah among the property sold to settle debts. The 4th additional death was particularly disturbing because it suggested Dinah's victims extended beyond her legal owners. In April 1839, between Harrison Blackwell's death and William Hendricks's purchase of Dinah, a slave trader named Marcus Webb died suddenly while transporting enslaved workers from Montgomery to Selma. Webb's death had been attributed to apoplexy, but the circumstances matched the pattern: death during sleep, locked door, peaceful expression, no signs of struggle. Whitfield's final report, submitted to county officials in October 1841, documented 9 confirmed victims and 1 probable victim, making Dinah the most prolific serial killer in Alabama history and quite possibly in American history up to that point. The report recommended that all deaths among plantation owners be examined with greater scrutiny in the future, that coroners receive training in recognizing signs of suffocation that might be disguised as natural death, and that enslaved workers' employment histories be tracked more carefully to identify patterns that might indicate criminal behavior. The complete files of Whitfield's investigation were sealed by court order in November 1841, classified as sensitive law enforcement records that might inspire similar violence if made public. The seal would remain in place for over 100 years until historians gained access in the 1950s and discovered the full scope of Dinah's systematic revenge against the men who had enslaved her and the system that had torn her from her mother at age 13.